In the Rosebush. When Mrs. Frisby got home, Teresa, Martin, and Cynthia were eating supper, as she had told them to do if it got dark before she returned. Coming silently down the tunnel, she could hear them talking in the room below, and she paused a moment to eavesdrop on their conversation. Obviously, Cynthia had been worrying, and Teresa was reassuring her.
She couldn't have got back sooner than this, Cindy. Don't you remember? The crow said it was a mile to the tree. It might even be farther. Yes, but crows fly so fast. But if he went 2 miles high,
that was Martin,
it would be 3 miles altogether.
6, said Teresa.
2 up, 2 down, and 1 to get there and 1 to get back. That's right. No wonder she isn't back yet. But what about the owl? You know how owls are. It was still light when they got there. He couldn't see. But it's dark now, said Cynthia. Oh, I wish she'd come back. I'm scared. Not so loud, Teresa said. Timothy will hear. I'm home, called Mrs. Frisby, hurrying the rest of the way down. And now it appeared that they had all been worried, for they ran to her, and even Martin, who ordinarily avoided such displays, threw his arm around her. Oh, Mother, cried Cynthia, near tears. I was so worried. Poor Cynthia. It's all right. How high did you fly? Asked Martin, recovering quickly. High enough so the trees looked like bushes, the garden like a postcard, and the river like a snake. Did you see the owl? What did he say? I saw him. Later I'll tell you about it. First, I wanted to see Timothy. How is he? Why didn't you move his bed out here? Teresa said. I wanted to, but he said he'd rather stay in the bedroom. I think he's feeling worse again.
But when Mrs. Frisby went to see him, she found him sitting up, and his forehead felt not at all feverish. I'm all right, he said. I stayed in here because I wanted to think about something. Think about what? About moving day. Moving day? But why? What about it? Had he, after all, overheard her talking to the others, heard about her flight to the owl? But no, he was explaining. I haven't been outdoors since I got sick, so I don't know what it's like. I mean the weather. But today, this afternoon, I noticed something. What was that? A smell in the air, a warm, wet smell. If you sniff, you can still smell it, though it's not so strong now. Mrs. Frisby had noticed this, of course, both indoors and out. It's the smell of the frost melting, Timothy went on. I remember it from last year, and after that, it wasn't long until we moved. Mother, when are we going to move this year? Oh, not for a long time yet. Mrs. Frisby tried to sound as casual as she could. It's still much too cold, too early to think about it. I have to think about it, said Timothy. He sounded serious, but calm and unworried. Because if it comes too soon, I don't know if I can go. I tried walking a little bit today in here when the others were outside. Timothy, you're supposed to stay in bed. You'll make yourself sick again. I know, but I had to find out, and I didn't walk much. I couldn't. I only went a few steps. I got so dizzy, I had to lie down again. Of course you did. You haven't really recovered yet. I guess I haven't. That's why I wanted to think. Timothy, you must not worry about it. That will only make you worse. I'm not worried at all. Thought I would be, but I'm not. Or maybe I think I should be, but I can't. What I really think about is how nice it is there in the summer beside the brook. It's true, I want to go, but I'm not scared.
I was afraid you might be, or that you might think I was. That's really what I wanted to tell you. I'm just going to wait and see what happens, so you shouldn't worry about it either.
Mrs. Frisby realized that he had somehow switched their positions. He had seen the danger he was in, guessed somehow that moving day was near, and that he was likely to die. And yet here he was, reassuring her. She wanted to tell him about the owl and the rats, tell him that something still might be done. But she decided she had better not. She did not really know if they would help. It would be better to wait until she had seen them. So instead, she said rather lamely,
Timothy, don't think about it anymore. When the time comes, we'll see how you are and then decide what to do.
The next morning at daybreak, she went to see the rats. She had never been in the rose bush before, never even really close to it, and now the nearer she got, the more nervous she became. No one had ever told her, nor, as far as she knew, told any of the other animals to keep away from it. It was just something one knew. The rats on Mr. Fitzgibbon's farm kept to themselves. One did not prowl in their domain. She had, before coming out of the garden, looked around carefully to be sure Dragon was nowhere in sight. But even Dragon, though he would chase a rat up to the edge of the bush, would not follow him into it. The thorns, of course, helped to discourage trespassers. Mrs. Frisby had never realized until that moment, standing next to it, how very big the bush was, how dense, how incredibly thorny. It was bigger than the tractor shed, and its branches were so densely intertwined that, as small as she was, Mrs. Frisby could find no easy way to crawl into it. Though she walked all the way around it looking, she remembered approximately where she had seen the rats go in, and she studied that part of the bush carefully. How had they done it? Then she saw that on one branch, close to the ground, the thorns had been scraped off, and about a half-inch of it, just big enough for a handhold, was worn smooth. She put her hand on this and pushed timidly. The branch yielded easily, rather like a swinging door, and behind it she saw a trail, a sort of tunnel through the bush, wide enough so that she could walk into it without touching thorns on either side. When she went forward, she released the branch, and it swung back silently into place behind her. She was inside the bush, and it was dark. She walked forward, peering into the dimness and following the small trail which wound in a curving course toward the center of the bush, its earthen floor packed firm by the pressure of small feet. Then, straight ahead of her, she saw the entrance. She had expected what? A round hole in the dirt, most likely, but certainly nothing like what she saw. First, a sizable clearing, about 5 feet across, had been cut from the center of the bush. Branches overhead had been cleared away too, not quite to the top of the bush, but almost so that the sunlight filtered through easily, and soft moss grew on the ground. In the middle of this bright green cave rose a small mound, 8 inches tall, in the end of which was an arched entrance neatly lined with stone, like a small doorway without any door. Behind the entrance, a tunnel, its floor also lined with stones, led backward and downward. Beside the entranceway, looking at her with dark, unblinking eyes, stood the biggest rat she had ever seen. Brutus.
"Stop where you are,"
said the rat.
"How did you get in here?"
I walked in,
said Mrs. Frisby, keeping her voice calm with an effort.
I found a branch with the thorn smoothed off. I pushed it back and found.
"I know," said the rat rather rudely. "And now walk out again. You aren't allowed in here."
He moved a few inches toward her, placing himself between her and the entrance. She noticed how powerful his muscles looked under his glossy coat. He would almost be a match for Dragon. Almost, but not quite.
Go on,
He repeated.
But I have a reason.
I don't care what you have. Go away. You're small. I wouldn't want to hurt you.
Are you Justin?
Mrs. Frisby inched back as the rat inched forward.
I'm Brutus. Justin's not here.
That was reasonably obvious, Mrs. Frisby thought. The rat named Brutus added.
You know Justin?
No,
Said Mrs. Frisby.
that is, not exactly.
If you don't know him, how do you know his name?
Brutus sounded puzzled, and Mrs. Frisby observed that although he was greatly oversized and muscular, and his eyes were bright enough, he looked very young.
It was told to me by a friend. Can I see him?
Justin? No, he's at a meeting. I'm taking his place. They're all at a meeting, not me.
Bad luck, thought Mrs. Frisby. He's a substitute, she said.
Then I'll wait for him.
No, said Brutus. You can't stay here. I've got orders. Now go, or I'll have to take you out myself.
He moved forward again.
My name,
Said the mouse desperately.
is Mrs. Jonathan Frisby. I want to see Nicodemus.
It did not work.
I don't care what your name is, and you can't see Nicodemus, that's sure.
Brutus now looked both puzzled and annoyed.
Move on, and be quick.
All right,
Said Mrs. Frisby.
you needn't force me. I'll go.
She turned slowly and walked back the way she had come. She felt like crying after coming all this way, after flying to see the owl, to be turned back so abruptly at the end. She thought, as she walked into the darker part of the bush, maybe she could just wait for an hour or so until the meeting, what kind of meeting could it be, was over, and then go back, and perhaps the rat named Justin would be at the entrance then. But would Justin pay any more attention to her than Brutus had done? She had a feeling that he would. But when she stopped, she heard footsteps behind her. She looked back and saw that Brutus was following her, so she started again, hurrying to keep out of his sight. After a while, she paused again and listened. This time there was no sound. He must have gone back to his post. She sat down on the ground. Then, ahead of her, in the direction of the place where she had entered the bush, she heard a rustle, a faint scraping noise. It was the branch she had pushed to get in. Someone else was moving it. Someone was coming in, walking along the narrow path toward her. It must be another rat. Suddenly she was terrified. What would he do, meeting her unexpectedly in this dimness? She shrank to one side, as close as she could get to the wall of thorns, hoping that whoever it was might go on past, not seeing her. Then he came around the curve, and she saw him. It was her old friend, Mr. Ages, the white mouse. He was moving extremely slowly, and she realized that he was limping badly. One of his legs was injured. It was wrapped up in splints and bandages.
Mr. Ages,
She called softly.
it's Mrs. Frisby.
Who?
He peered into the shadow.
I can't see you.
Mrs. Frisby.
She moved into the middle of the path in front of him.
Why, so it is, Mrs. Frisby. How do you do?
Oh.
He sounded cordial enough, but he was startled.
I didn't know that you... How do you happen to be in here?
It's a long story.
Then tell it to me while I rest. I'm supposed to be at a meeting, but I'm late already, and a few minutes more won't matter. As you can see, I had a bad fall and broke my ankle.
I'm sorry to hear that. I hope it doesn't hurt.
It is mending, but I can walk only slowly and need to rest frequently.
He sat down with a sigh.
Now, tell me what you're doing in the rat's bush.
Mrs. Frisby, who was wondering the same thing about him, told him as briefly as she could about Timothy, Jeremy, the owl, and Brutus. Mr. Ages listened in silence, interrupting only once.
You went into the owl's tree?
Yes, but I was afraid.
I should think so. That took courage.
I had to do it. When she had finished her story, Mr. Ages sat quietly for a minute, considering it.
Poor Timothy, he said at last. I should have thought of that myself. But, of course, when I gave you the medicine, the weather had not yet turned warm. Then I fell and broke my leg, and I forgot all about it.
He stood up.
I think, he said, that you should come with me back to the entrance.
But I can't. Brutus will still be there.
Mrs. Frisby, having done all that you have done, you are not going to give up now. I'll talk to Brutus.
You know him?
I have known him since he was born. He's not very old, you know. I think he will do what I ask.
From the way he said this, Mrs. Frisby could tell he did not merely think it. He knew it. But how? All right, she said doubtfully. I'll try again, but I don't understand. How do you know Brutus?
We had better move along.
They started back toward the entrance at Mr. Ages' slow, limping pace.
As to how I know Brutus, that's a much longer story than yours, and I doubt that I'm the one to tell it to you. It is for Nicodemus to say. But I will tell you this. If we go in the entrance, as we will, if you are to ask for help, you must promise that you will never tell anyone anything at all about what you see and hear.
I will promise, said Mrs. Frisby. Again, she thought she had no choice. The owl told me that too. When they approached the entrance again, Mrs. Frisby saw that Brutus stood at his post as before, but that another rat had joined him. Two of them, she thought. I hope Mr. Ages knows them both. The new rat saw them coming. He looked alert, dark gray in color, and extraordinarily handsome, though not so huge as Brutus.
Mr. Ages, he said, how's the leg? Better, but it will be a while before I can run again. Justin, said Brutus, staring at Mrs. Frisby. There she is. That's the one I was telling you about.
Is she now? Justin looked at her casually. He did not sound particularly alarmed.
Mrs. Frisby, said Mr. Ages formally, may I present my friends Justin and Brutus?
How do you do? Brutus sounded doubtful. Mrs. Frisby, said Justin. Not Mrs. Jonathan Frisby?
She is Mrs. Jonathan Frisby, said Mr. Ages, a widow, as you know.
Madam, said Justin, bowing politely, it is an honor to meet you. Brutus now looked astonished.
You both know her? Who is she?
Brutus, said Mr. Ages gently.
Don't you remember Mr. Jonathan?
Brutus wrinkled his brow.
Mr. Jonathan? You mean the one dragon?
Yes, said Justin quickly. And this is Mrs. Jonathan.
Oh,
said Brutus. Then to Mrs. Frisby.
Why didn't you tell me? I wouldn't have chased you off.
Well, said Mrs. Frisby, I did try, but it doesn't matter.
No, Mr. Ages added, because on the way out she met me coming in. She needs to talk to Nicodemus, and quickly.
Brutus looked doubtful again.
Nicodemus? But can she? I mean, how about the rules? What about the plan?
Mr. Ages said,
that has been taken care of. She has promised secrecy, and she is to be trusted completely. That I myself guarantee. After all, consider who she is."
As an afterthought, he added,
"And who her children are."
"Who am I then?" Mrs. Frisby asked herself in wonder. "I suppose that, too, will have to come from Nicodemus." Mr. Ages said to Justin,
"What about the meeting? It can't be over already."
"It was temporarily adjourned," said Justin, "to wait for you. In fact, I came to find you."
"Then I suppose we had better go in."
Justin led the way through the arched entrance, with Mrs. Frisby and Mr. Ages following. Brutus remained outside at his post. In the library, the tunnel led gently downward, and after the first dozen steps they were in darkness. Mrs. Frisby could see nothing at all. Behind her, Mr. Ages limped along. Ahead, she could hear the scuffle of Justin's footsteps. She followed the sound blindly. Then she heard his voice.
"Just walk straight forward, Mrs. Frisby. There's nothing to trip over and nothing to bump into. If you get off course, you'll feel the wall," he added. "The dark part doesn't last long."
Now, what did he mean by that? She thought it over for a minute or two as she walked, and had just decided to ask him, when to her surprise she saw ahead of her a faint glow. A light? But how could there be a light down so far?
"There, we're through it," said Justin cheerfully. "I know that blackout bit must be annoying the first time, but it's necessary."
But aren't we underground?
"Oh, yes, about 3 feet down by now, I guess."
Then how can it be light?
"I could tell you," Justin said, "but if you wait 15 seconds, you'll see for yourself."
In a few more steps, the tunnel, Mrs. Frisby could now discern dimly its shape and direction, took a turn to the right, and she did see for herself. She stopped in astonishment. Ahead of her stretched a long, well-lit hallway. Its ceiling and walls were a smoothly curved arch, its floor hard and flat, with a soft layer of carpet down the middle. The light came from the walls, where every foot or so on both sides a tiny light bulb had been recessed, and the hole in which it stood, like a small window, had been covered with a square of colored glass, blue, green, or yellow. The effect was that of stained glass windows in sunlight. Justin was watching her and smiling.
"Do you like it? The carpet and the colored glass we don't really need. Some of the wives did that on their own, just for looks. They cut the glass, believe it or not, from old bottles. The carpet was a piece of trim they found somewhere."
"It's beautiful," Mrs. Frisby said. "But how—"
"We've had electricity for 4 years now."
"5," said Mr. Ages.
"5," said Justin agreeably. "The lights—"
They were very small, very bright, twinkling kind.
"We found on trees. In fact, most of our lights come from trees. Not until after Christmas, of course, about New Year's. The big light bulbs we have trouble handling."
Mrs. Frisby was familiar with electricity. Her husband, who knew all kinds of things, had once explained it to her. At night, she had seen the lamps shining in Mr. Fitzgibbon's house, and at Christmas time the lights that his son strung on a pine tree outside. "You mean you just took them?" she asked.
"We were careful to take only a few from each tree," said Mr. Ages. "It was like picking fruit," Justin said rather dreamily. "The annual light bulb harvest. We had to go quite far up the road before we had enough. Even so, it took 2 Christmases." "Justin," said Mr. Ages, "I think we'd better get on."
They continued along the corridor, which curved always slightly to the right, so Mrs. Frisby could never really tell how long it was, and which soon began to incline more steeply into the ground. Mrs. Frisby noticed that the air, which should have been dank and damp so deep underground, was on the contrary fresh and clean, and she thought she could even detect a very faint breeze blowing past her ears as she moved. In a few more minutes the hall widened abruptly into a large oval chamber. Here the lights were set in the ceiling. At the far end, Mrs. Frisby could see the long tunnel continued and looked as if it slanted upward again, perhaps to another entrance, a back door. Was this, then, their destination, the main hall of the rats? But if so, where were all the other rats? The room was entirely empty, not even a stick of furniture.
A storeroom, said Justin. Sometimes full, now empty.
Then she saw that off one side of the chamber there was a stairway leading down, and beside it a small door. Justin led them to the door.
For freight only,
he said with a grin at Mr. Ages.
But considering your limp, I think we can make an exception. The stairs wouldn't be easy.
Mrs. Frisby looked at the stairway. It went down in a spiral, and each step was neatly inlaid with a rectangular piece of slate. She could not tell how far down it led, since after the first turn of the spiral she could see no more, but she had a feeling it was a long way down. As Justin said, it would be hard for Mr. Ages. Justin opened the door. It led into a square room that looked like a closet.
After you,
he said. Mrs. Frisby went in, the others followed, and the door swung shut. On the wall were two knobs. Justin pushed one of them, and Mrs. Frisby, who had never been in an elevator before, gasped and almost fell as she felt the floor suddenly sink beneath her feet. Justin reached out a hand to steady her.
It's all right, he said. I should have warned you.
But we're falling.
Not quite. We're going down, but we've got two strong cables and an electric motor holding us.
Still, Mrs. Frisby held her breath during the rest of the descent, until finally the small elevator came to a gentle stop and Justin opened the door. Then she breathed again and looked out. The room before her was at least 3 times as big as the one they had just left, and corridors radiated from it in as many directions as petals from a daisy. Directly opposite the elevator, an open arch led into what looked like a still larger room, seemingly some kind of an assembly hall, for it had a raised platform at one end. And now there were the rats. Rats by dozens, rats standing and talking in groups of 2s and 3s and 4s, rats walking slowly, rats hurrying, rats carrying papers. As Mrs. Frisby stepped from the elevator, it became obvious that strangers were a rarity down there, for the hubbub of a dozen conversations stopped abruptly, and all heads turned to look at her. They did not look hostile, nor were they alarmed, since her 2 companions were familiar to them, but merely curious. Then, as quickly as it had died out, the sound of talking began again, as if the rats were too polite to stand and stare. But one of them, a lean rat with a scarred face, left his group and walked towards them.
Justin, Mr. Ages, and I see we have a guest.
He spoke graciously, with an air of quiet dignity, and Mrs. Frisby noticed 2 more things about him. First, the scar on his face ran across his left eye, and over this eye he wore a black patch fastened by a cord around his head. Second, he carried a satchel, rather like a handbag, by a strap over his shoulders.
A guest whose name you will recognize, said Justin. She is Mrs. Jonathan Frisby. Mrs. Frisby, this is Nicodemus. A name I recognize indeed, said the rat called Nicodemus. Mrs. Frisby, are you perhaps aware of this? Your late husband was one of our greatest friends. You are welcome here.
Thank you, said Mrs. Frisby, but she was more puzzled than ever. In fact, I did not know that you knew my husband, but I'm glad to hear it because I've come to ask your help.
Mrs. Frisby has a problem, said Mr. Ages, an urgent one. If we can help you, we will, said Nicodemus.
He asked Mr. Ages.
Can it wait until after the meeting? An hour? We were just ready to begin again.
Mr. Ages considered.
An hour will make no difference, I think, Nicodemus said. Justin, show Mrs. Frisby to the library where she can be comfortable until the meeting is over.
By this time, the last of the other assembled rats had made their way into a large meeting hall, where she sat facing the raised platform. Nicodemus followed them, pulling some papers and a small reading glass from the satchel at his side as he walked to the front of the room. Justin led Mrs. Frisby in another direction, down a corridor to their left, and again she had the impression of a faint, cool breeze against her face. She realized that the corridor she had walked in up above was merely a long entranceway, and that the halls around her were the rats' real living quarters. The one down which Justin led her was lined with doors, one of which he opened. "In here," he said. The room they entered was big, square, well lit, and had a faint, musty smell. "It's reasonably comfortable, and if you like to read," he gestured at the walls. They were lined with shelves from floor to ceiling, and on the shelves stood, Mrs. Frisby dredged in her memory. "Books," she said. "They're books." "Yes," said Justin. "Do you read much?" "Only a little," said Mrs. Frisby. "My husband taught me, and the children." She started to tell him how, laboriously scratching letters in the earth with a stick. It seemed so long ago, but Justin was leaving. "Excuse me, I've got to go to the meeting. I hate meetings, but this one's important. We're finishing up the schedule for the plan." He pronounced it with a capital P. "The plan?" But he was out the door, closing it gently behind him. Mrs. Frisby looked around her. The room, the library, Nicodemus had called it, had, in addition to its shelves of books, several tables with benches beside them, and on these were stacked more books, some of them open. Books. Her husband, Jonathan, had told her about them. He had taught her and the children to read. The children had mastered it quickly, but she herself could barely manage the simplest words. She had thought perhaps it was because she was older. He had also told her about electricity. He had known these things, and so it emerged did the rats. It had never occurred to her until now to wonder how he knew them. He had always known so many things, and she had accepted that as a matter of course. But who had taught him to read? Strangely, it also emerged that he had known the rats. Had they taught him? What had been his connection with them? She remembered his long visits with Mr. Ages, and Mr. Ages knew the rats too. She sighed. Perhaps when the meeting was over and she had had a chance to talk to Nicodemus, and had told him about Timothy and moving day, perhaps when that was settled, he could explain all this to her. She noticed at the far end of the room a section of wall where there were no bookshelves. There was instead a blackboard covered with words and numbers written in white chalk. There were pieces of chalk and an eraser in a rack at the bottom of it. The blackboard stood near the end of the longest of the tables. Was the library also used as a classroom? When she looked at the blackboard and rather laboriously read what was written on it, she saw that it was not. It was rather a conference room. At the top of the board, in large letters, were printed the words, "The Plan of the Rats of NIMH."
I have a plan.